Welcome to Attic Static. Today we have two stories for you, The Vigil of the Velvet Peak and The Archive of Unspoken Echoes. Sit down, relax, and enjoy. The Vigil of the Velvet Peak. I have spent 3 years pretending that I am a brave man, a man who can face any shadow and conquer any silence. But tonight, as I sit by the dying embers of the hearth in my cabin at Velvet Peak, I finally have to admit the truth. The horror wasn't just what was out there in the snow, it was the cost of closing my eyes. It started on the third night of the blizzard. The resort had emptied, the lifts were frozen in place like skeletal giants, and the hum of machinery had been replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of falling powder. I thought it was a luxury to be alone, until the first shift happened. I was reclining in my armchair, a book resting on my lap, when I drifted into a light doze. For 3 seconds, my eyelids fluttered. In those 3 seconds, the cabin didn't just feel quiet, it felt occupied. When I snapped my eyes open, the chair opposite me, which had been empty moments before, was now occupied by something draped in heavy, gray velvet. It didn't have a face, not exactly. It was more of a suggestion of a head and shoulders, swaying slightly as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told myself it was an optical illusion, a trick of the firelight. But then, I felt the temperature drop until my breath misted in front of my face. The velvet figure tilted its head, and I heard a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Asterisk, you blinked. Asterisk, I realized then that the rules of Velvet Peak were different from the rest of the world. In this resort, after the lifts shut down, the dreamers emerged. They exist in the periphery of consciousness. As long as you are awake, they're content to linger at the edges of your vision, shy and respectful. But the moment you fall asleep, you surrender your territory. I spent the next hour in a state of terrified vigilance. Every time my chin dipped toward my chest, I would jerk myself upright. The figure moved closer with every blink. It was no longer just sitting, it was pacing. It glided across the floorboards, its velvet body absorbing the light of the fire. When I slept for even a minute, it would migrate from the chair to the foot of the bed, then to the ceiling above my head, stretching out long, spindly limbs that seemed to be made of woven shadows. By midnight, the cabin felt crowded. It wasn't just the velvet figure anymore. Others had joined it. There were the Weaver, a creature with hundreds of needle-thin fingers constantly knitting the air, and the Sigh, a tall, translucent pillar of mist that moved only when I wasn't looking directly at it. I began to panic. The more I tried to stay awake, the more exhausted my body became. My eyes felt heavy, burning with the strain of fighting gravity. Every time I drifted off, the creatures would claim a piece of the room. The Weaver would knit a web of silver silk over my desk. The Sigh would wrap itself around my legs like a cold shroud. I remembered what the old caretaker had whispered to me on the first day. Asterisk, do not let the velvet catch your eyelids, for once you sleep, you belong to them. Asterisk / I tried to find a rhythm. I began to hum a low, constant drone that vibrated in my chest. It was a physical anchor. Whenever my thoughts started to wander toward the hazy meadows of sleep, I would hum louder. I watched the velvet figure intently. It was now standing mere inches from my face, its texture looking like deep, crushed moss. Its face, a simple slit where eyes should be, was wide open. Around 3 a.m., the ultimate test came. My body finally gave in to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I felt my eyelids become leaden. Just as they began to seal shut, I saw the Weaver reach out a single needle-thin finger and touch my forehead. I gasped, my eyes flying open. It was as if the fear of falling asleep gave me a second wind. I sat bolt upright, staring at the creature. It paused, its finger hovering just above my skin. Then, in a voice that sounded like a flute played underwater, it whispered, "Stay." I didn't want to stay awake forever, but I couldn't bear the thought of what would happen if I did. So, I made a bargain with the silence. I closed my eyes, not into a deep sleep, but into a controlled rest. I let myself drift just deep enough to dream, but kept one half of my brain hovering on the surface of consciousness, like a buoy on a dark lake. In that twilight state, the horror became beautiful. The velvet figure didn't snatch me. It sat beside me and began to hum in harmony with my own drone. The weaver knitted a crown of silk around my head while I drifted. The sigh cradled me in its misty arms. When the sun finally broke over the peaks the next morning, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold, I woke up completely. The cabin was empty. No velvet, no silk, no mist. Only a single strand of silver thread remained on my lap, and the faint scent of crushed moss lingered in the air. I got out of bed and looked at the chair opposite mine. It was empty, but there was a small indentation in the cushion where the velvet figure had sat. I realized then that it hadn't been trying to steal my life. It was simply waiting for me to share it. I took a deep breath, stepped into the morning light, and finally, peacefully allowed myself to fall into a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing they were there to catch me. And now, our next story. The Archive of Unspoken Echoes. Log entry. October 12th, 6 p.m., I have been appointed as the night caretaker for the Oakhaven Public Library. It is a sprawling, Victorian-style structure that smells of vanilla, dust, and old paper. The townspeople say it is a quiet place, but tonight, I found something peculiar in the basement archives. Tucked behind a stack of crumbling encyclopedias was an antique brass gramophone and a single, leather-bound logbook with my name written on the cover in elegant, looping script, the record of unspoken thoughts. Log entry. October 13th, 8 p.m. I decided to test it. I sat in the velvet chair, held the gramophone needle over the spinning plate, and simply thought about my morning coffee, the way the steam curled and the bitter taste on my tongue. I didn't speak a word. When the needle hit the groove, a voice emerged. It was my own voice, clear as a bell, whispering, Asterisk, the steam is like a ghost dancing over the dark sea. Asterisk, I froze. I hadn't said that out loud. It was a thought, tucked away in the back of my mind, never voiced to a living ear. Log entry. October 14th, 9:30 p.m. The library felt heavier tonight. The shadows seemed to stretch further toward the center of the room. I spent an hour thinking about my childhood home, the creaky floorboard in the hallway, and the way my mother used to hum while she cooked. I sat in silence for 10 minutes, letting the memories wash over me. When I played the record again, the gramophone produced a haunting melody followed by my voice. Asterisk, the wood groans like an old man's bones, but her humming is the thread that sews the house together. Asterisk, it was perfect. It captured the nuance of my internal monologue. /log entry. October 15th, 10:45 p.m. Strange things began to happen during the day. I noticed that whenever I thought of a word, it felt as though it were being pulled out of my head by an invisible string. By evening, the library felt alive. Every time a book fell or a chair shifted, I found myself thinking, Asterisk, why did that happen? Asterisk, I played the record. The gramophone replied, Asterisk, because the silence is getting hungry. Asterisk, my heart skipped. I hadn't thought the word hungry regarding the silence. The library was beginning to anticipate my thoughts before I even fully formed them. Log entry. October 16th, 11 p.m. /the atmosphere shifted from cozy to unsettling. As I walked through the stacks, a cold draft swept past my neck. I thought of the feeling of being watched by someone just out of sight. I didn't have to wait long for the record to play. The voice was no longer just reflecting, it was layering. You feel watched because you are, the gramophone whispered. Then a second layer of sound, a faint, dry rasp, joined my own. It wasn't my thought. It was something else. Log entry. October 17th, 12:30 a.m. I stayed up late, terrified to move. I noticed that the more thoughts I fed into the gramophone, the more it seemed to influence my actual mood. If I thought of a minor worry, the record played it back with such intensity that the worry became an anxiety. I tried to think of something purely happy, a sunny meadow, but as soon as the thought formed, the gramophone crackled and produced, Asterisk, the sun is a bright eye, but the grass remembers the rain. Asterisk, it was becoming more poetic, more complex. It wasn't just recording my thoughts anymore, it was refining them. /log entry. October 18th, 1 a.m. Something is wrong with the rhythm of my mind. I found myself thinking about the gramophone constantly. Asterisk, is it listening? Asterisk, I thought. The record played instantly, almost as if it were eavesdropping on my subconscious in real time. Asterisk, I am not just listening to what you think. I am stealing what you haven't said yet. Asterisk, that night, the shadows in the corners of the library began to pulse like a heartbeat. Log entry, October 19th, 2 a.m., / the silence is no longer silent. There is a low hum in the air, the sound of thousands of unsaid words vibrating against the shelves. I tried to think of nothing, a pure mental blankness. But even then, the gramophone spun and produced a hollow, echoing sound. Asterisk, even your emptiness has a name. Asterisk / I felt a shiver. The library was beginning to feel crowded, as if every thought ever conceived by anyone in this room was now living inside these walls. Log entry, October 20th, 3:15 a.m. The escalation reached a fever pitch. I sat in the center of the room, eyes closed. I felt a pressure behind my ears. My thoughts were moving faster than I could track them, a whirlwind of memories, fears, and desires. / the gramophone began to spin rapidly, the needle dancing across the grooves. It wasn't just one voice anymore. My voice was joined by dozens of others, some high-pitched, some gravelly, all overlapping in a beautiful, terrifying choir of internal monologues. / log entry, October 21st, 4 a.m. I realized the truth. The library wasn't just a building, it was a reservoir for the unspoken. Every thought I had never bothered to say out loud lived here, waiting in the dust. Suddenly, the gramophone gave one final, massive burst of sound. It played every thought I had had since entering the library that night, all at once, compressed into a single second of symphonic clarity. It was the sound of my entire soul exhaling. / log entry, October 22nd, morning. The gramophone is still. The needle has reached the very end of the groove. The library is perfectly silent again. I walked to the door and took one last look at the brass horn. On the floor, where the dust had been thickest, there was a single new word written in the dust by the gramophone's vibration. Asterisk, finished. Asterisk, I left the keys on the table and walked out into the morning sun. For the first time in weeks, my head felt completely empty, light as a feather. I didn't need to think anything else. The library had finally heard it all. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.